Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today in our 450th episode...
Milestone!
It is. I guess all the 50 marks since maybe 250? Maybe 150?
We started at 100, then we skipped to 200, and then ever since then we've been doing it once a year, every 50 episodes or 50 weeks.
Yeah. So it shifts slowly through the year.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have to do like a leap year at some point to adjust. But yeah, we're doing a milestone episode about ceratopsians, which I'm calling the Triceratops celebration or ceratopsian celebration, but not everybody knows ceratopsians. So Triceratops.
We had a few suggestions for this one. We had Celebration of Ceratopsians, we had Ceratopsian Serenade, and Triceratops Revisited, because we have talked about Triceratops before, but it's been a while, and there was a lot of things that we didn't say last time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the first time was something like episode 30, I think. It was in the very early days of the podcast.
Yes.
We've certainly learned a lot about dinosaurs and even specifically Triceratops since then. So before we get into all of that Triceratops goodness, we want to thank some of our patrons. And this week we want to thank 10 existing patrons. They are Bruce, Brooke, Cameron, Alex, Saskisaurus, Bradley, Wouter, Toon Rex, Dang, and Micah Marcos Music.
All right. Thank you so much for being part of our Dino-It-All community.
Helping us reach 450 episodes.
Yes. Here's to another 450 episodes. All right, moving on to our celebration of ceratopsian serenade. I would say Triceratops celebration, except the Triceratops is our dinosaur of the day, so that's a little bit later.
Yeah.
I want to thank our patrons Butts McGee and Cha Raptor for the suggestions. It was ceratopsians in general and a review of Triceratops and the Nomum dubium Triceratops species. We can't get to all of the ceratopsians named, but we will talk about a lot of them.
That's probably good. I feel like the Hadrosaurus hootenanny, where you tried to name like almost all the hadrosaurs.
I just went for the ones that were lumped and split.
It was so many.
Oh. I think some people liked it.
Some people did, yeah. I was overwhelmed.
I'm guessing you were not one of those fans. Okay.
I was a fan. I was just overwhelmed because it was a lot.
Well, you can imagine. I did the research.
Yeah. I don't know how you did that.
There's a lot of sources for this episode, like all of our milestone episodes, but the main two, in case you want to pick up your own copies, are Dinosaurs, the most complete, up-to-date encyclopedia for dinosaur lovers of all ages. This is by Dr. Thomas R. Holtz Jr. and illustrated by Louis V. Ray. And The Complete Dinosaur, second edition, edited by M.K. Brett Sermon, Thomas R. Holtz Jr., and James O. Farlow. That'll give you an idea, roughly, of what we talk about in this episode.
Yeah, those books are great for some of the older stuff, because even though I always kind of chuckle with the most complete up-to-date start, you're setting yourself up for failure with that title, because once it's 10 years old, it's not the most complete up-to-date anymore.
It's the most complete up-to-date up to, 2007?
Yeah. So everything pre-2007, and there was a lot of Triceratops stuff pre-2007, so it's a great reference for any of those older dinosaurs, but for newer stuff, that's why we made the podcast.
So we'll have links to those books in our show notes if you want to get your own copies. All right, let's start with the basics. So ceratopsia means horned faces. They are herbivorous dinosaurs with beaks. They've been found in what's now North America, Europe, and Asia. They mostly lived in the Cretaceous. The earlier ancestors did live in the Jurassic. Ceratopsia may have originated in Asia, and then maybe they moved across the Bering Strait. Southern Hemisphere ceratopsians include the Australian Serendipitoceratops. We only know the ulna, so part of the arm. And Notoceratops from Argentina, which is a single toothless jaw that's been lost.
Nice.
We don't know too much there. There's also some possible ceratopsians from Europe. One of the earliest known ceratopsians is Yinlong Downzai. That's from about 161 to 155 million years ago. The genus name means hidden dragon, and it refers to the movie Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. If you remember that one from, I think, 2000.
Must have been all the rage when they found it.
Well, it wasn't named until 2006 by Xu Xing and others. It lived in the late Jurassic in what is now Xinjiang, China. It was about 3.9 feet or 1.2 meters long and weighed up to 22 pounds or 10 kilograms. So just a reminder that ceratopsians started out pretty small. It did not have a frill and it didn't really have horns. It also probably walked on two legs and it had shorter arms and long legs. There was some ornamentation on the back of its head, which before was thought only to be on pachycephalosaurs. As a side note, ceratopsians and pachycephalosaurs are part of the same clade of ornithischians called marginocephalia.
Or marginocephalia.
Oh, yes, depending on your preference. So that's one of the earliest known ceratopsians, and then the latest species of ceratopsia was Triceratops prorsus, which I will get into in the dinosaur of the day.
Latest and greatest.
It depends who you ask. The first ceratopsian remains were found back in 1855 by F.V. Hayden. They were teeth that were thought to be trachodon.
In other words, a hadrosaur.
Yes, that happened back in the 1800s.
Yeah. I thought that was really interesting that the first, because ceratopsian, obviously the name ceratopsian was much later, looking back at this fossil and things. But since it means horn face, you'd think like, oh, the first ceratopsian has got to be a horn, it's got to be a frill, it's got to be something. But it was teeth, just like it is with so many prehistoric animals.
And it's hard to know anything about what it looked like when you just know the teeth.
Yeah, or even what it came from. So they find it with a trachodon / Edmontosaurus and go like, okay, well, it must go with this.
Yep. Well, one of the first named ceratopsia was Ceratops, which might seem obvious if it's the group name, but Ceratops is now a nomum dubium.
Yeah, Ceratops is a deep cut. That's not like a common household name for a dinosaur at all.
Yeah, unless you mispronounce Triceratops and you forget the tri. I don't know.
Well, there's Ceratops, Biceratops, and Triceratops. Not really.
The type species was Ceratops montanus. And again, Ceratops means horn face. The fossils were found in Montana in the Judith River Formation. John Bell Hatcher found a pair of horns in 1888. He was working for O.C. Marsh at the time, so during the Bone Wars. Marsh thought that Ceratops was smaller than Stegosaurus and had two horns on the back of its head and walked on 2 feet, and said that it would have, quote, represented a very strange appearance.
That would be strange.
Yes.
Having 2 horns on the back of the head.
What I think of strange is walking on 2 feet, although I guess the earlier ones were more 2-footers than 4-footers.
Yeah. I guess partly when you say walking on 2 feet, I imagine something kind of in like a human stance. So like a Triceratops, like fully vertical, but with horns sticking out of the back of its head.
Well, it's no dinosauroid.
Yeah.
Now, like I said, Ceratops is now a novum dubium because there's just not enough known to distinguish it as its valid dinosaur.
Yeah, but it makes sense, right? It's the first time you've ever found horns like this, and you think like, wow, these horns must be very unique to this animal because we've never seen anything like it.
Yeah.
So you name a new dinosaur, and then you find 100 more that you can specifically name, and it's like those horns could be from anything.
Yeah. Go back and revise.
Mm-hmm.
Marsh also named Ceratops horridus in 1889, but soon after that one became Triceratops horridus. Hatcher in 1905 renamed 3 monoclonius species as ceratops. There was Ceratops recurvicornis, Ceratops belli, and Ceratops canadensis. Ceratops alticornis also became Triceratops alticornis after it was Bison alticornis, because originally they thought it was a bison, not a dinosaur at all.
I love that.
Monoclonius belli eventually became Chasmosaurus belli. So here we go. A little bit of lumping and splitting there.
It's too bad Monoclonius didn't stick around. I really like that name. It's like single horn. It's like unicorn, basically.
It's the unicorn of dinosaurs. I think technically it means single sprout, but I know what you're going for.
Yeah. Good point. Single sprouting horn.
Now, ceratopsians, they all had parrot-like beaks. And early ceratopsians, like Psittacosaurus, they were small and they walked on 2 legs. Psittacosaurus was a basal ceratopsian, basal to almost all ceratopsians except maybe Chaoyangsauridae, which includes Yinglong. Psittacosaurus had 4 digits on its hand instead of 5, like other ceratopsians.
Oh, interesting. It gained a digit.
Yeah, so Psittacosaurus was like the cartoon version, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
These cartoons usually have 4 fingers.
Yeah, who needs 5? It's just excessive.
Psittacosaurids, they're relatively small. They're no more than 2 meters long. And they had large, short skulls with a deep snout and wide cheekbones that end in a small point or horn. We talked about Psittacosaurus back in episode 92. We do know its full skeleton. We even know that it had a quote-unquote belly button.
Yeah. Yeah, and its coloring and the little feather...
The frill, or the quill.
Yeah.
Not the frill.
Quill-like proto-feather thing going down the middle of the top of its tail.
Yes, it did also have a frill. So just as a quick recap, the genus name Psittacosaurus means parrot lizard.
Aptly named.
Yes. It was discovered in 1922 by Roy Chapman Andrews and named in 1923 by Henry Fairfield Osborn. And it's one of the most well-known dinosaurs. Something like more than 400 individuals have been found.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing.
Which is how you're able to find things like belly buttons.
Yeah. And it happens to be in an area where you get some pretty good preservation and a lot of articulated individuals too.
Yes.
I think there's even a nest of them, if I remember right, that's got like a dozen just in one spot.
Could be.
It's one of those close relatives if it's not Psittacosaurus.
We also know that it ate using gastroliths, the rounded pebbles to help it digest. The belly button, if you want to hear more, we talked about that in episode 408. Technically, it's an umbilicus. As an embryo, it got its nutrients from membranes, including a yolk sac, and before hatching, the membranes detach and leave an umbilical scar, which is similar to our belly buttons.
Yeah, I feel like it's still valid to call it a belly button because that's not like a really scientific term, is it?
I like saying a belly button because how often do you talk about dinosaur belly buttons?
Just a belly button caused by something slightly different.
Yep. There's another basal ceratopsian, that's Hongsanosaurus, but that one may actually be Psittacosaurus. Just going back to our earlier ceratopsians. Now, later ceratopsians, they were large and they had the horns and the frills. These frills may have been for display or regulating their temperature, or to help them with chewing, or possibly to or protect their neck.
Yep. Why not all of the above?
Yeah, the chewing I hadn't really thought too much about before, but Richard Swanlow thought that the frills were an attachment site for large jaw muscles.
Certainly matches with the huge, powerful-looking beak and the deep head and all that stuff. Definitely looks like it was putting in some bite force.
Yeah, it's really interesting thinking about what goes into chewing.
And where all the muscles can attach. It's very complicated.
Yeah. Not something I think about when I'm eating my dinner. But maybe I should. Now, the horns and the frills may have been for competing for mates. The horns may also have been for defense. Bone beds of ceratopsians have been found, so some of them may have lived in herds. There's been bone beds found of Pachyrhinosaurus, Centrosaurus, Styracosaurus, Ionosaurus, Anchiceratops, Chasmosaurus, Triceratops, and Ankylosaurus.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it was in the Tom Holtz book, they were talking about how just because you find bone beds of some of them doesn't mean that they're all gregarious. I think he did an analogy for like some deer, like reindeer, are in really big herds, and then you get white-tailed deer that are in little groups, and then you have something like a moose, they're all very close relatives, but the moose like to be completely solitary.
Yeah.
So it's hard to know, especially when you're talking about millions of years apart, because all those animals live today and are close relatives.
Yes.
And we're talking about a span of tens of millions of years all over the world. So
it's even hard to know when you have the bone bed because it's like, did they just all happen to be in that site when something catastrophic happened?
Yeah. They all got buried in that spot. But was that just like a once a year occurrence, or did they always stay together? And, were they all related or were they different? Because we can't do like testing to see if they're all part of a family genetically or if they're from different parents.
Yeah, we just have this one fossilized moment in time. So ceratopsians, they're known for their rostral bone, which gives them that parrot-like beak. And that's actually what makes them a ceratopsian. Not the frills, not the horns, nothing else. It's that parrot-like beak.
That's the original synapomorphy or whatever you want to call it, the defining characteristic.
Yeah, because not all of them had the frills and the horns.
That's true.
It's a bone at the end of their upper jaw, and it's covered by a horny beak. They've used it to snap off plants. Marsh classified ceratopsia in 1890. In 1872, during another expedition, Fielding Bradford Meek found large bones and let Cope know. So again, this is around Bone Wars time, or the beginning of it. Cope named those bones Agathalmus sylvestris, which means marvelous forest dweller.
That's a really nice name.
Yeah.
That's another nice name that we lost, though, I think.
Yes, and Cope also named Monoclonius, so.
Poor Cope. All the recent episodes we talk about Cope and Marsh, it really seems like Marsh is winning. Marsh named Triceratops, Cope named Agathalmus and Monoclonius.
Yeah.
He definitely won in terms of ceratopsians, for sure.
Yeah, because Cope also named Polyonyx.
Oh, of course, Polyonyx.
Yeah, no one really talks about that one. And now, at the time, ceratopsians weren't a group yet. This is 1872, and Cope thought that the frill bone was part of the breastbone.
Oops.
But then he realized that his dinosaurs were also horned dinosaurs.
Well, I mean, all those early frills, too, were just like a little piece. It wasn't like the whole skull. They were working from fragments.
True. In 1907, Hatcher and others published a monograph on ceratopsids.
Ah, Hatcher.
Yeah, Hatcher comes up a lot. He's got that Triceratops named after him.
That's what I was thinking of, yeah. The one that's at the Smithsonian getting chewed on by T-Rex now.
Yes. That is the latest iteration of Hatcher.
Poor Hatcher. At that point, do you want the dinosaur named after you if it's just getting chewed on?
Yeah, it's an iconic dinosaur.
That's true.
Plus, John Bell Hatcher lived in the early 1900s, so he doesn't know.
Yeah, good point.
Now, before we dive deeper into the subgroups of ceratopsia, we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors. All right, within ceratopsia, kind of drilling down a little more, we have Neoceratopsia, which means new horned faces, and that includes ceratopsidae.
That's the real money makers, are the ceratopsids.
It's the ones that most people probably think of, yeah.
Yep. Triceratops, Styracosaurus, all the big ones.
Well, Neoceratopsia includes ceratopsians that are more derived than psittacosaurids. There's a subset of Neoceratopsia that's called Coronosauria. They first developed the neck frill and several neck vertebrae fused to support their bigger heads.
I haven't heard of that one before.
I don't think everyone uses that name. Some were so large they had to walk on all fours, and some of them had horns over their eyes. The horns were for display or scaring off predators or for defense or fighting with each other. A lot of skulls are preserved, and many species are known only from their skulls.
Yeah, that's why it's so surprising that they only found teeth in the beginning, because I feel like if you only find one part of a ceratopsian, it seems like it's always the skull.
Yeah.
But I guess just like every dinosaur, you find more teeth than anything.
Got to start somewhere. Some frills had big holes in them that would have been covered in skin.
Yeah, I think a lot of the paleo art, though, they show there are actual holes. I don't know if everyone agrees that the holes would have been completely covered in skin.
Yeah, it might depend.
I think that does make the most sense, though.
The frills were possibly used for display. Some of them were solid, and they might have acted as a shield for the neck. Neoceratopsia, they had a strong bite and dental batteries. Going into even more detail, we've got some other subgroups/families, starting with Protoceratopsidae. Those are basal ceratopsians that lived in the Late Cretaceous. They're mostly found in what is now China and Mongolia. They had dental batteries, they were pretty small, and they had frills and horns. They were smaller than ceratopsids.
Yeah, a lot smaller.
Yeah, and you can think of Protoceratops as one of them, which makes sense. It's Protoceratopsidae. We talked about Protoceratops in episode 154 as a quick recap. The genus name means first horned face. It was described in 1923, and it lived in the Late Cretaceous in what is now Mongolia and China. It was about 6 feet or 1.8 meters long and could weigh up to 400 pounds or 180 kilograms. And Protoceratops is famous because it's part of the fighting dinosaurs, that fossil of Protoceratops and Velociraptor locked in battle when they died.
Yeah, one of the coolest fossils of all time.
Mm-hmm. It's really holding its own there.
Yeah, especially because like they're around the same size, and the Protoceratops, obviously, well, I guess it's a stalemate because they both ended up getting fossilized together. It was pretty good though.
Yeah.
Taking on a predator your size.
Yes, especially with those claws. We've also got Leptoceratopsidae. They lived in Asia, North America, Europe. They had relatively short frills. They're a small group of medium to large bodied species, and they had short, deep skulls and large jaws. This group includes Leptoceratops, which we talked about in episode 260. That genus name means little horned face. It was about 6.6 feet or 2 meters long and weighed between 150 to 440 pounds or 68 to 200 kilograms. And that one was named in 1914 by Barnum Brown. And then last, we have the main group, I think, Ceratopsidae. These have probably the most famous and well-known dinosaurs, like Triceratops. Ceratopsidae lived in the Late Cretaceous, mostly in North America, but there was also Sinoceratops and Tyrannoceratops. We covered Sinoceratops in episode 178. It was named in 2010 by Xuxing and others and found in China. Tyrannoceratops was found in Uzbekistan, and it walked on all fours, and it had a beak, horns, and frill. There are two groups within Ceratopsidae, and we've talked a bit about these, but I'll go over it again. You've got centrosaurinae and chasmosaurinae. Centrosaurinae means pointed lizards. Centrosaurines are generally known for having an impressive nasal horn, but shorter frills and shorter horns above their eyes compared to chasmosaurines. This doesn't apply to all of them, though.
Yeah, they do have a pretty long nasal horn, though, in most cases. So part of the way I always think of centrosaurine as like they have the one center horn is how I remember which group they are. Like Styracosaurus has like the one really long nose horn, but then pretty short ones above the eyes.
Well, that's a good way to think about it. But yeah, because like we were saying, there are centrosaurines that did have long brow horns like Albertoceratops, and that is unusual for a centrosaurine.
Yeah. That's a good example of convergent evolution. For whatever reason, it was better off with longer brow horns, and so they ended up with the same thing going on that the Chasmosaurs had.
Yeah. The centrosaurines are they're smaller than chasmosaurs.
Smaller and flashier.
Yes, small and flashy. That's nice and pithy. The oldest known centrosaur is Menephiceratops. We talked about that one as a news item in episode 338. It was described in 2021. The genus name means Menephi Formation Horned Face, and it was found in New Mexico in the US. Then there's Centrosaurus. We talked about that one in episode 105. That genus name means pointed lizard. It had small hornlets on its frills and a pair of small horns above its eyes, and a long frill with holes in it. It was about 20 feet or 6 meters long. There's also Styracosaurus, like you were saying, Garrett.
The prettiest of the ceratopsians, I feel like.
Yeah, it is. Partly why we picked it as our patch. We talked about Styracosaurus in episode 42. It's got the openings in the frill and 4 to 6 long spikes that stuck out from the frill. A lot of skulls have been found, and they show that individuals all looked slightly different. For example, some frills had hooks and knobs on them.
Yeah, it's a very elaborate frill. It's pretty cool.
Yes. And there's also Ionosaurus. We talked about that one in episode 106. It's known for the horn on its nose that had this strong curve forward. It also had 2 large spikes that stuck out from the edge of its frill.
I knew that name was familiar. Now I remember why. Because almost all of them, they sort of curve up and back like on a rhino, but on that one, it curves up and forward.
Yeah.
Like it's going to poke you without even having to bend its head down.
Yep. On the chasmosaur side, chasmosaurinae means opening lizards. Chasmosaurines are the last of the ceratopsians to have survived. They're also typically larger than centrosaurines. They're generally known for having long frills without spikes, long horns above their eyes, and a short nasal horn. A couple include Regaliceratops. Its name means royal horned face, and that refers to the built-in crown on its head, the frill. There's triangles line the edge of the frill, and it had distinct round decorations on the frill itself. And there's Cosmoceratops. This dinosaur had one of the fanciest frills. Bending over the top of the frill were hook-like bony extensions.
Yeah, that's true. I guess saying that Styracosaurus was the prettiest, it's got a lot of a lot of competition.
Yeah.
Depends what you like in your frill. There's a frill for you. No matter which ceratopsian or I guess human you are, there's a frill that you'll like.
And then, of course, probably the most famous chasmosaur of all is Triceratops.
Mm-hmm. Boring frill, but really impressive horns. At least boring frill edge. By pure size, the frill's very impressive.
Yes. It's very smooth, though, that frill. So without further ado, we'll go on to our dinosaur of the day, Triceratops Revisited. And again, thank you to Butts McGee and Cha Raptor for requesting this dinosaur / milestone episode. Gary, you already mentioned we did cover Triceratops, but that was way back in episode 30, and now we're on episode 450, 8 years later.
It's been a while.
It has been a while. There are a couple of species that we'll talk about too. Triceratops species, or depending on who you ask, Torosaurus and Netoceratops, because they're up for debate. We'll also talk about the Nomum dubium Triceratops species as requested. When it comes to species and debates, though, it mostly comes down to Torosaurus and Netoceratops. The rest of the Triceratops species are all synonyms. So Triceratops was a chasmosaurine ceratopsian that lived in the Late Cretaceous in what is now North America. Like we were saying, it had a short frill like a centrosaurine, but long brow horns like a chasmosaur, so it was confusing as to which group it belonged. But now we think it's a chasmosaurine. The only trait it had in common with centrosaurs was the short frill.
Really? I never knew that Triceratops was considered to have a short frill.
Yeah, because if you're just looking at that head, it looks ginormous.
Yeah, I guess it's proportional to the rest of the head or something, is how they consider it short. It seems pretty big to me, though.
As a side note, Zuniceratops is the oldest known ceratopsian with brow horns. So Triceratops, it had that, I guess, short, but to us, large bony frill, and 3 horns on the skull, and they were long brow horns. In 2022, paleontologists studied the skin of Triceratops and keratin of some of its distant relatives, including Psittacosaurus, and they found that the keratin covering Triceratops' brow horns may have made its horns much bigger, possibly almost 5 feet or about 1.5 meters long.
Yeah, that's because every animal that has horns, basically, I shouldn't say every, most animals that have horns, big like bony things sticking out of them, cover them in keratin to get more mileage out of it because it's easier to grow the keratin over the top than just keep growing more and more bone.
Yeah, that takes a lot more energy.
Mm-hmm.
Probably hurts more too when you're injured.
Yeah, it's true because there's blood supply in the bone, but less so in the keratin.
So Triceratops, it was large, it walked on 4 legs. It's got a lot of similarities to bison and rhinos. It was estimated to be up to 26 to 30 feet or 8 to 9 meters long and weigh 5.5 to 9.9 tons.
That's about the same weight as a T-Rex then.
Well, good, they were foes. So they had a chance.
Picking on someone their own size, those T-Rex.
Yeah. Triceratops had a large skull relative to its body. Its head was about 1/4 of the body length, and in some cases, 1/3. One specimen, nicknamed Kelsey, was about 22 to 24 feet, or 6.7 to 7.3 meters long, with a 6.5 foot or 2 meter long skull, and it weighed about 6 tons. There's another skull estimated to be 8.2 feet or 2.5 meters long. A lot of Triceratops skulls have been found. Actually, more than 50 Triceratops skulls have been found in just the Hell Creek Formation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty common.
Yeah. It had a robust skeleton, in other words, a sturdy build. Again, it walked on all 4s. There's a debate about whether Triceratops sprawled or stood upright. The latest is that it's somewhere in between, with its elbows slightly bent, similar to a modern rhino.
Maybe even a little bit more bent than a rhino.
Yeah. It had 5 fingers. The fingers pointed out and away from the body. Triceratops skin has been found, so we know it had large scales. Skin on a frill has also been found, and that one had small polygonal scales. Triceratops had a large beak. That's the thing that makes it a ceratopsian.
The specific type of large beak.
Yeah. The top is formed by the rostral bone. It also had a dental battery. It probably plucked and grasped food with the beak. And it probably ate fibrous plants, possibly palms, cycads, or ferns.
It's good to get your fiber.
Yeah. The frill, it's thought to have been used to help it chew as an anchor point to help increase the size and power of the jaw muscles, but there doesn't seem to be evidence of large muscle attachments on the frill bones.
Yeah, it's always complicated though. Like we were talking about, if it's a wider surface, then it's harder to see the direct muscle attachment points because it can be spread out more evenly.
Mm-hmm. It had a horn on the snout and, again, the brow horns, the two horns above the eyes, and a bony frill that is considered to be short. As a juvenile, the horns were stubs that curved backwards.
Stubs.
Mark Goodwin and Jack Horner in 2006 studied 10 skulls from babies to adults, and they found babies had stubs for horns, and then as juveniles, the horns curve. As subadults, they straighten, and as adults, they recurve to the front. And the juvenile frills started to get ornaments.
Other people think those are different species.
The frills and horns, again, they might have been used for defense, or for identifying each other, or attracting mates, or displaying dominance like how modern animals with antlers and horns do. And they kind of show this in Prehistoric Planet too.
I mean, it's useful to have huge, impressive horns for a variety of reasons.
Yes.
I'm glad we don't have them, though.
I was going to say,
really annoying.
I don't actually know because I don't have horns.
Yeah.
In 2013, Dave Hone and Darren Naish found that the horns and frills probably weren't for species recognition, or at least it wasn't the primary role for horns. Ceratopsians change quite a bit as they grow up, so it wouldn't have helped them when they were younger.
Yeah, those species recognition things tend not to be like they show up when you're a juvenile. That's more of a display type thing.
Yeah. The frill may have helped to regulate body temperature, and the frills and horns may have been to help fight predators like Tyrannosaurus.
I don't think I've ever heard the Triceratops frill as a body temperature. I'm used to hearing it with the Spinosaurus sail or Dimetrodon sail and things like that, but not Triceratops frill. That's interesting.
Stegosaurus plates.
Yeah. It makes sense. It's close to the head too. A lot of times you want to dissipate some heat from the brain, for example.
Yeah. The Triceratops lived in swampy areas, as we saw in Prehistoric Planet 2. And again, it lived alongside Tyrannosaurus. There's evidence that Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops fought each other. There are partially healed Tyrannosaur tooth marks on a Triceratops brow horn, and the horn is broken with new bone growth after the break. So it survived it. Triceratops may have also fought each other with their horns. There's one Triceratops skull found with a hole that looks like it was created by a Triceratops horn.
Yeah, that's intense.
Rough, yeah.
I don't want anything poking holes in my bones.
Anywhere.
Yeah.
Skin. Yeah. Anywhere.
Definitely not my head.
Yeah. In 2022, last year, Ruggero D'Anastasio and others found that Big John, a Triceratops that was found in 2014 in South Dakota, had pathologies from a lesion, possibly from another Triceratops horn, and it was in the process of healing, but then Big John died. It seems likely that Big John lived at least 6 months after that fight. In 2020, Rina Sakagami and Soichiro Kawabe found Triceratops to have a small olfactory bulb, so its sense of smell wasn't great, but they also found it could hear low frequencies. It may have held its head about 45 degrees to the ground, which would really show off its horns and frill and make it easy to graze.
Yeah, especially because the way they sort of curve up on some of the species too, it would be pretty impressive even just as they're eating.
Yeah. We'll talk more about Triceratops behavior and also, of course, the debates with Torosaurus and Netosaurus in a little bit, but first we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors. In 2022, Wyman and others studied the metabolism of dinosaurs and suggested that Triceratops was ectothermic or more cold-blooded like modern reptiles. We covered this in episode 414 as a quick recap, though. Ectothermic means an animal can't regulate its own body temperature, so how warm or cold it is depends on its surroundings. This team figured out how much oxygen an animal used or breathed by testing the fossils, and they looked at femurs of 55 animals and found that Triceratops was more ectothermic, which means that they were less active and they probably basked in the sun and they may have migrated when it got cold.
At least that is their interpretation.
Yes. It's unclear if Triceratops traveled in herds. One bone bed was found in Montana, but it only had juvenile Triceratops. In 2012, 3 Triceratops ranging from juvenile to adult was found in Wyoming, and they may have been traveling together as a family. But again, like you were saying, Garrett, We don't know for sure that they were a family.
Yeah. There's a lot of, what do you call it in a courtroom? Circumstantial evidence. Nothing definitive beyond a reasonable doubt. But, depending on the type of trial, we might go with, yeah, they were families.
The Triceratops are on trial.
Yeah.
And Triceratops is one of the last known non-avian dinosaurs. Fossils have been found in the Evanston Formation, Scollard Formation, Laramie Formation, Lance Formation, Denver Formation, and of course the Hell Creek Formation. So it's been found in Montana, South Dakota, Colorado, Wyoming, and in Saskatchewan and Alberta.
Yeah, those are all basically at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Or very close in time.
Triceratops, the genus name, means three-horned face. It was first described in 1889 by O.C. Marsh. Many specimens have been found, ranging from hatchling to adult. The first named fossil, now thought to be Triceratops, was a pair of horns. George Lyman Cannon found them in Colorado in 1887 and sent them to Marsh, who thought that they belonged to a large bison, and he named it Bison alticornis. In 1887, Marsh wrote, quote, "This specimen, which may be regarded as the type, indicates one of the largest of American bovines, and one differing widely from those already described. The horn cores, instead of being short and transverse, as in the existing bisons, are long and elevated with slender pointed ends." End quote. I imagine it's very different from a bison.
Yeah.
The next year, Marsh named Ceratops, but he still thought that those first horns were from bison. In 1889, he wrote, quote, "The strange reptile described by the writer as Ceratops montanus proves to have been only a subordinate member of the family. Other remains received more recently indicate forms much larger and more grotesque in appearance." He's talking about Ceratops horridus there. Mostly wanted to read that quote because of the grotesque in appearance.
Mm-hmm.
Then a third, more complete Triceratops skull was found, and Marsh finally changed his mind on the first horns. They were no longer bison to him. The Triceratops holotype was found in 1888 in the Lance Formation in Wyoming by John Bell Hatcher, but Marsh named it Ceratops. A cowboy, Edmund Wilson, first saw the skull, and he threw a lasso around one of the horns to get it out, but it broke off, and the skull fell to the bottom of a cliff.
That's not the recommended way of extracting fossils.
No.
Trying to pull them out with a rope. They tend to be pretty firmly stuck in the rock.
Yes. Wilson brought the horn to Charles Guernsey, a fossil collector, who showed it to Hatcher, and then Marsh told Hatcher, "Collect that skull." So it was first called Ceratops horridus. After they found the third horn, Marsh changed it to Triceratops horridus.
So if they'd only found two, maybe it would have been Biceratops.
Maybe. Or it might have just stayed Ceratops. The species name horridus means rough or rugose and refers to the rough texture of the fossils. Hatcher collected 31 Triceratops skulls between 1889 and 1891. That's a lot in just 2 years.
Yeah. Especially considering you said there were basically about 50 found so far, and like 31 of them were found in the first 2 years, 3 years.
50 found in the Hell Creek Formation, but there are a lot of other formations.
Oh, true. Yeah.
There are 2 valid species of Triceratops today, Triceratops horridus and Triceratops prorsus. But in the past, there have been up to 17 species.
As you get with the Bone Wars, just every time you find a fossil, name a species.
A few ones that are no longer valid include Brevicornis, Elatus, Calicornis, Serratus, Flabellitus.
Flabellitus, that's a fun one.
Yeah. Abusus, Hatcheri, Eurycephalus, Albertensis, Gallius, Ingens, Maximus, Sulcatus, and Sylvestris.
So Hatcher actually got a species named after him at one point.
Oh, I think Hatcher's got a few things named after him. He was a big deal. Now, scientists eventually thought that there were fewer species, and the differences in the skulls was due to individual variation. John Ostrom and Peter Wellenhofer in 1986 proposed there was only Triceratops horridus, based on there being usually only 1 or 2 species of a large animal in a region. Catherine Forrester reanalyzed Triceratops fossils and found that there's 2 species, horridus and prorsus. They also found Netoceratops to be a separate genus, and I will get into that in a minute. In 2009, John Scannella and Denver Fowler agreed. In 2014, Scannella, Fowler, Goodwin, and Horner studied over 50 skulls of Triceratops and suggested that Triceratops horridus evolved into Triceratops prorsus over a period of 1 to 2 million years, so it was a case of anagenesis.
Yeah, they're very rare and difficult to prove type of evolution.
Yes. But really cool if it's true.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess I shouldn't say it's that rare because everything evolves from another species. But
Yep.
in terms of actually being able to determine it, it's rare.
Triceratops horridus had a shorter nasal horn. Its brow horns faced forward, and it had a longer snout. Triceratops prorsus had a longer nasal horn. The brow horns were pointed more upward, and it had a shorter, deeper snout. As we mentioned, Edward Cope also named a couple ceratopsians, Agathalmus and Polyonyx, which they may actually be Triceratops. Agathalmus, they only found a pelvis, some vertebrae, and a few ribs, so we only know for sure it's a ceratopsian.
Yeah, when mostly you find skulls, it's hard when you find just a pelvis
Yes.
to know what it is.
And with Polyonyx, we have only found parts of the horns, some vertebrae, and parts of the limbs, so we also only know for sure it's a ceratopsian. So on to the main debate. There's been a lot of debates on Torosaurus and Netoceratops, and we've talked a fair amount about it on our show. Torosaurus, if you concur that Torosaurus is its own genus, had an elongated skull and 2 holes in the frill.
Otherwise, Triceratops as an adult had an elongated skull with 2 holes in its frill.
Yes. Torosaurus was named in 1891 based on 2 skulls. Its name, Torosaurus, means perforated lizard and refers to the openings in the frill. It's been found in as far north as Saskatchewan and as far south as Texas. Fossils have been found in Wyoming, Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, Colorado, Utah, and then, of course, Saskatchewan, and possibly Texas and New Mexico. It is not as common of a find as Triceratops. It had one of the largest skulls. It had a longer frill than Triceratops, and it had the large openings, and it had 5 or more pairs of hornlets on the back of the frill. It also had a shorter nose horn. The fossils, again, they were found in 1891. It was a pair of skulls with long frills and holes in the frills. Those were found in Wyoming by Hatcher. Marsh named them Torosaurus latus and Torosaurus gladius. The species name latus means the wide one and refers to the frill, and the name gladius means sword. There are 3 species, Latus, or there were 3 species, Latus, gladius, and utahensis. Only Latus and utahensis, though, are still considered valid.
Oh, not Gladius.
No.
The sword one.
Torosaurus utahensis was originally described as a Rhinoceratops utahensis in 1946 by Charles Whitney Gilmore based on a frill fragment found in Utah. But then it was renamed in 1976 to Torosaurus by Douglas Lawson. Torosaurus had a long frill and triangular osteoderms on the edge of the frill. There's some individual variation in Torosaurus specimens, which makes sense. There was also individual variation in Triceratops.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in 2009, John Scannella and Jack Horner found Torosaurus was just a growth stage of Triceratops, that adult stage, or the later adult stage. They studied over 50 specimens, including over 30 skulls, and they reclassified Torosaurus as an adult Triceratops.
And changed all the mounts in their museum to say Triceratops.
The key here is that ceratopsian skulls have metaplastic bone, which can change in length over time and form new shapes. Now, there's a lot of variety in Triceratops skulls, and some subadult Triceratops skulls have 2 thin areas in the frill in roughly the same spot as the holes in Torosaurus, so it's possible that the holes opened up later to lighten the load of the skull as Triceratops grew its longer frills. In 2011, Jack Horner and Ellen Therese Lamb studied the frills and found that there was a lot of resorption. They also said it was likely that the frill of a mature Triceratops with the holes weighed the same as the frill of a large subadult without the holes.
That's why you like having holes in your skull.
Yep.
We have a lot of them too. Makes the head lighter. You don't want a big heavy head if you can avoid it.
Andrew Farkey said that Triceratops and Torosaurus, however, are distinct. Even though the only difference between them is the frill, he argued that the change in the frill is something that we don't see in other ceratopsids, and it would involve a lot of changes, including the bone texture reverting from what it's like as an adult to what it's like as an immature individual and then back to an adult. So it would just require too much change for this to happen.
Yeah, like the edge of the frill on the juveniles, it's like a bunch of little points, and then they sort of get smoothed over and fused together over time. But then you were saying in Torosaurus, it's got some bumps. So it's gone back.
But Scannella and Horner responded to Farkey, and one of their responses was that Torosaurus lattice specimens might be an early stage of Triceratops evolving again, part of anagenesis. Triceratops skulls do have areas, again, where the bone is thin. In 2012, Nicholas Longrich and Daniel Field found, quote, that a well-defined sequence of changes exists in horned dinosaurs. Development of cranial ornament occurs in juveniles, followed by fusion of the skull roof in subadults, and finally, the epoccipitals, epijugals, and rostral fuse to the skull in adults, end quote. And based on that, they found both mature and immature Triceratops and Torosaurus individuals. They also found that the idea that Torosaurus was Triceratops, the tauromorph hypothesis, would mean that their fossils should be found in the same locations, that all Torosaurus specimens would be adults and no Triceratops specimens would be very old, and that transitional forms could be found between the two. Now, Torosaurus and Triceratops did live around the same time and place. They're not in all the same locations, but that could be because not many Torosaurus specimens have been found compared to Triceratops, and there could be a sampling bias. Longrich studied 36 specimens to check which ones were adults and found that most Torosaurus specimens were old, but there were two exceptions of a young adult and an even younger individual. Both had the extended neck frill and openings in the skull, more so than a similarly aged Triceratops. They also found that 10 Triceratops skulls were about as old as the oldest Torosaurus specimens. They found that the thin areas on Triceratops frills could be the beginnings of turning into holes like Torosaurus, but they said the structures were in different positions. In 2013, Leonard Maiorino and others found Triceratops and Torosaurus to be distinct. So this is a case, I think the debate's going to go for a while. We just need more fossils.
Yeah, because we don't have any really young fossils that anybody is saying is a Torosaurus. We've got a couple that are on the younger side, but then there's always individual variation and things like that. So
right. Well, Longrich did say they were the two specimens, but yeah, not a lot of people
not
seem
that
to
young.
cite that. Yeah. In 2022, last year, Mallon and others said that there were two specimens found in Canada in the Frenchman and Scallard formations that were subadult Torosaurus, and said Torosaurus is valid. So yeah, the debate continues.
I think most people are still on team splitter for there's a separate Torosaurus and Triceratops. But yeah, there are a fair number of people that think they're both Triceratops.
Yeah. Then we've got the other debate around Netoceratops. We covered Netoceratops in episode 219. It lived in the Late Cretaceous in what is now Wyoming in the US, the Lance Formation. Only one skull has been found, though it's nearly complete. It was found in 1891 and described by Marsh in his Ceratopsidae monograph, but Marsh died before he finished that monograph, and John Hatcher tried to finish, but then he died before finishing. He died in 1904 of typhus, so the paper was incomplete, and then Richard Swan Lull published it in 1905.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is almost like a cursed paper.
Almost. Well, Lull named Hatcher's description of the skull Diceratops hatteri, so it's almost Biceratops. It's a two-horned face. He published that one separately. But then in 1933, Lull changed his mind and made it a subgenus of Triceratops as Triceratops hatteri. So there we go. That's how Hatcher got his Triceratops. Although I guess really he got the Smithsonian one. Anyway.
So since he almost named it Diceratops, but didn't actually name it Diceratops and lumped it in with Triceratops, that means if somebody later decided it deserved its own genus, they had to come up with a new name.
Yeah. He actually did name it Diceratops. He published that separately. He just changed his mind later.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Netoceratops means insufficient horned face. Its name refers to it not having a nasal horn.
I'm surprised it didn't just go back to Diceratops then. Gotta ask the ICZNY.
Its brow horns are almost vertical and it had holes in the frill. Some of them might have been from injury or disease. It had a low rounded nasal horn, different from the larger pointed Triceratops horns, but there is some individual variation in Triceratops. In 2011, Scannell and Horner studied Netoceratops and found it to be part of the Triceratops growth series. They suggested that Netoceratops was an intermediate growth stage between Triceratops and Torosaurus, and therefore a synonym of Triceratops. Netoceratops had smaller holes in its frill compared to Torosaurus. Longrich and Fields found the frill holes in the Netoceratops skull to be a pathology, though. But they also thought that it was still a synonym of Triceratops. Scannell and Horner suggested the skull lost its nasal horn either when it was alive or when it was fossilized. It's unclear when. Andrew Farkey said, though, that Netoceratops was its own taxon, so it's another case of we need more fossils. It's really hard to know from just one skull.
But if it deserves to be lumped, you're only ever going to find the one.
Yeah.
In this case.
Triceratops, of course, is in a lot of films. It's on stamps. It's in a lot of media. It's also the state fossil of South Dakota and the state dinosaur of Wyoming. Charles Knight painted a mural of a Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops fighting in 1942, which probably solidified this idea of them fighting.
Yes, and I think also made both of them extra famous, although they had already been in movies before that point.
Yeah. Hatcher, the Triceratops at the Smithsonian, was the first Triceratops to go on exhibit. When Hatcher was first going, the dinosaur, not the person, was going on display in 1905, it was pieced together by 10 individuals. So they made Hatcher's head too small for its body, the front legs were different lengths, and it had the wrong feet because it was a composite. Originally, they put Hatcher, the Triceratops, its posture with elbows at nearly shoulder level.
Ooh, really in push-up pose.
Yeah. But in the 1990s, Hatcher got an update, and in 2001, they put it in a more upright position. And now it's in the new Deep Time exhibit, and like you were saying, Garrett, it's being eaten by the nation's T-Rex.
Yeah, it's a clever way to not have to worry about its posture. Just have it dead laying there, getting chewed on, and then you don't have to worry about it.
Good point. Future-proofing.
Yeah.
As a fun side note, the Boston Evening Transcript in 1901 had an article titled Making a Triceratops, and this quote, well, the article, I'll say it's about Frederick Lucas from the Smithsonian, who illustrates his method of building up a Triceratops in a papier-mâché skeleton for the Buffalo Exposition. And the quote is, middle-aged persons who were brought up on the schoolbook story of Cuvier's ability to reconstruct a whole animal of a past era from one bone must prepare to revise their impressions of paleontology, end quote. And that just reminds me of today, how, we're brought up on a certain, whether it's Jurassic Park or Fantasia, at some point we have this idea of what a dinosaur looks like, and things change.
We need that on a t-shirt. Prepare to revise your impression of paleontology.
So catchy.
Be prepared. It's going to change.
Another Triceratops known as Pops the Triceratops is on display at the Weld County Administrative Building in Colorado, and that's near where it was found back in 1982. Also on display in 2020, the Melbourne Museum got the world's most complete Triceratops skeleton. It's 87% complete with a 99% complete skull, and that Triceratops was found in the US in 2014. You can now see it in Australia. They paid $3 million for it.
It's hard to know if that is a ridiculous amount or a good deal. I guess it depends on your perspective.
Yeah.
Triceratops is awesome, though.
Yes.
As are Torosaurus and all those other genus and species names that may or may not be Triceratops. And our fun fact of the day is that despite similarities to rhinos, Triceratops was bigger than an elephant.
Oh, yep. That makes sense.
The main reason I bring that up is because whenever I'm imagining a Triceratops, I imagine them way too small because I think of rhinos as like the modern analog, and that's just kind of the wrong frame of mind to get into.
Rhinos are big for us.
They are, and because of that, it's like, okay, yeah, rhinos are big, and they've got the big horn and everything, so sure, think of a Triceratops like that, but you actually have to think more like an elephant. So the San Diego Zoo has a really good page on rhinos. They say the largest rhino is the white rhino from sub-Saharan Africa, and the adults are about 13 feet or 4 meters long and are about 6 feet or 1.8 meters tall, which is obviously very big. It's taller than a lot of people, and even if it isn't, that horn could definitely reach your face. It's not something to mess with. They also weigh about 5,000 pounds or 2,300 kilograms. And on the show, we would probably say 2.3 tons or maybe 2.5 tons or 360 stone for our British listeners.
All right.
Black rhinos usually have the biggest horns of any rhino. They can grow up to about 4 feet or 1.3 meters long. And in that way, the horn size of a lot of ceratopsians were in the same ballpark as the horn size on a rhino. So if you're just thinking about the horn size, rhinos can be a good comparison. But the smallest ceratopsids, that's the real money group of ceratopsians, like you were talking about, the group with the big horns and frills at the end of the Cretaceous, were basically the same size as the largest rhinos. So the smallest ceratopsids and the largest rhinos just barely meet in the middle. So if you have a Venn diagram of ceratopsids and rhino size, they they just barely touch.
But they touch.
They do. Probably. Like Sabrina said, Triceratops was 26 feet or 8 meters long. And as best as I could estimate, it's about 3 meters or 10 feet tall, likely more. That's twice as long and twice as tall as a rhino. So if you're going just by dimensions, that's, 4 times as big. They also weighed around 8 tons, which is about 3 times as much as a rhino. In general, dinosaurs were a little bit bigger per pound. Triceratops is much closer in size to a large male African elephant, although Triceratops is still bigger than most, if not all of them. Triceratops is about the same size as some species of mammoth.
Wow.
It's another way to look at it. And it's about the same height as an African elephant, which is very tall. It's an intimidating animal to stand next to. Triceratops is significantly longer than an elephant. I couldn't find any good estimates or statements about how long elephants are. I guess people just don't really care. They care how tall they are, how heavy they are, how long their trunk is and stuff, but total body length isn't really interesting to people, I guess, with elephants.
At least that you could find.
Yeah. I searched quite a bit. Couldn't find it. Triceratops weighed more than an average African elephant. And going to the skull, a large African elephant, like, for example, P.T. Barnum's Jumbo, had a skull of about 3 feet or 1 meter long, not including the horns.
Wow.
Whereas Big John, the Triceratops, is reportedly 8 foot 7 inches or 2.62 meters long. Triceratops, therefore, had heads at least twice the size of an elephant. And elephants have pretty big heads. We're going based on skulls because we don't know how much soft tissue Triceratops had on their head.
So it might have been even bigger than that.
Or, kind of close-ish, maybe, because elephants have the big ears, right? And the trunk and everything. So they appear a lot bigger than just the skull.
And the tusks.
Yeah. Although the Triceratops had the horns.
True.
So if you're trying to imagine a Triceratops in the future, I would recommend not imagining a rhino, but instead start with the biggest elephant you've ever seen and then give it an even bigger head with a menacing horn instead of a trunk. Or just sort of imagine a Triceratops head on an elephant body or a mammoth body. And then you'd be in the right ballpark for what a Triceratops would be like in real life.
That's very large.
Yeah, extremely intimidating.
And on that intimidating note, that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Stay tuned. Next week, we have an interview with Dr. Will Tattersdale. He'll talk about the connections between dinosaur science and science fiction. If you enjoyed this episode, and if you enjoy listening to us every week talk about dinosaurs, then please tell a friend. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks again, and until next time.
Good day.